I saw my wife's car parked in front of a motel, and in that moment, something inside me didn't shatter, it went quiet. The kind of quiet that tells you your life is about to change whether you're ready or not. I kept both hands on the steering wheel, engine idling, eyes locked on that silver sedan I'd bought her 3 years ago for her birthday, the same car she told me was sitting outside her sister's place across town. The street was dim, one flickering street lamp casting a pale yellow glow over the cracked asphalt, and the motel sign buzzed overhead like it had something to say but couldn't quite spit it out. I checked my phone again, not because I needed confirmation but because part of me still wanted to be wrong. Her last text was still there. At my sister's, probably staying late, don't wait up. Simple, casual, nothing that should have raised alarms, except now it did. I leaned back slightly, exhaling slow, steady, like I was trying to keep something contained inside my chest. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Claire and I, we weren't perfect, but we were stable, or at least that's what I'd been telling myself for years. We had routines, predictable mornings, quiet dinners, weekend grocery runs, the kind of life that doesn't make headlines but feels solid enough to stand on. And yet, over the past couple months, something had shifted, not loud, not obvious. Just small things that didn't quite line up. She started turning her phone face down when she walked into a room, laughing a little too quickly at messages she never shared, coming home later than usual with explanations that sounded right but felt off. I noticed, of course I did, but I told myself it was stress, work, life, anything but what my gut was starting to whisper. I've always been the kind of man who fixes things, problems at work, things around the house, even moods. I find the issue, I handle it, I move on. But this didn't have a wrench or a manual. Earlier that evening, when she told me she was heading to her sister's place, I didn't question it, not out loud at least. I just nodded, kissed her on the cheek, and watched her walk out the door like I had 100 times before. But something about the way she avoided eye contact lingered with me longer than it should have. I tried to ignore it, sat on the couch, flipped through channels I wasn't really watching, but that feeling stayed, like a low hum you can't quite tune out. So I did something I don't usually do. I grabbed my keys and decided to drive. I told myself it was just to clear my head, maybe pick up some takeout, but deep down, I knew exactly where I was going. Her sister's house was about 20 minutes away, quiet neighborhood, familiar driveway. But when I pulled up, the spot where Claire's car should have been was empty. I sat there for a full minute, engine running, staring at nothing, waiting for something to make sense. I even checked the house, lights were on, but her sister answered the door looking surprised to see me, told me Claire hadn't been there all night. That was the moment something shifted, not panic, not anger. Just clarity. I nodded, said I must have mixed something up. Got back in my car, and drove without really thinking, and somehow, without a plan, without a map, I ended up here, parked across the street from a motel I'd never noticed before, staring at a car I knew better than my own reflection. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, and I realized my hands weren't shaking, my heart wasn't racing, I was just still. I didn't get out, didn't slam the door, didn't march inside like some kind of scene from a movie. Instead, I reached for my phone, opened the camera, and zoomed in just enough to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The license plate matched. Every scratch, every detail, it was hers. I let out a slow breath, almost like a laugh, but there was nothing funny about it. She thought I wouldn't know, she thought this was just another night she could rewrite. But sitting there in that quiet car, under that flickering light, I realized something simple and cold. Now I knew exactly where I stood. And more importantly, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I stayed in the car longer than I should have, watching nothing and everything at the same time, the motel doorways, the shadows behind curtains, the occasional flicker of movement. That meant nothing on its own but somehow felt like it meant everything tonight. The clock on the dashboard read 9:42 p.m., then 9:47, then 9:53, each minute stretching out like it was testing how long I could sit there without breaking. I thought about calling her, just to hear her voice, just to see if it would sound the same now that I knew what I knew, but I did not press the button. Because once you ask a question like that, you cannot unhear the answer. Instead, I opened our message thread again and read the last few weeks like it was evidence: short replies, delayed responses, little gaps where there used to be conversation. It was all there if I was honest, every sign I had chosen to explain away because it was easier to believe in the version of my life that made sense. I leaned forward, resting my forehead lightly against the steering wheel, and let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. The air inside the car felt different now, heavier, like it carried a truth I could not put back. After a while, I straightened up and adjusted the rearview mirror, not because I needed to but because I needed something to do with my hands. Across the lot, a door opened on the second floor, a rectangle of warm light cutting into the dark, and for a second my chest tightened before I even saw anything clearly. A figure stepped out, just a silhouette at first, then clearer under the hallway light. A man, average build. Nothing remarkable, the kind of person you would pass in a grocery store and never remember. He paused near the railing, glanced at his phone, then turned back toward the door as if waiting. I felt something shift again, not anger, not yet, just a quiet confirmation settling into place piece by piece. A few seconds later, the door opened wider, and Claire stepped out. She looked exactly like she had when she left the house earlier, same jacket, same hair, the small details I knew by heart. And yet standing there, she felt like a stranger. She said something to him. I could not hear it, but I saw the shape of her smile, casual, easy, like this was normal, like this was just another part of her day. He laughed, leaned against the doorframe, and she stepped closer to him for a moment before turning her head slightly, scanning the parking lot without really looking, the way people do when they are not expecting to be found. I sank lower in my seat out of instinct, not panic, just habit, like I was protecting something that was already gone. My phone was still in my hand, so I lifted it slowly and started recording, steady, focused, making sure the frame caught both of them, the room number above the door, the car in the lot below, every detail that could not be argued with later. My hands did not shake, which surprised me more than anything else. I watched them talk for another minute, maybe two. Time had started to blur again. Then she turned back toward the room, disappearing inside while he followed, the door closing softly behind them like nothing had happened. The light stayed on. I lowered the phone and looked at the screen for a second. The video still running, then stopped it, and saved it without replaying it. I did not need to watch it again, not tonight. I set the phone down on the passenger seat and leaned back, eyes on that closed door, feeling something settle into place inside me, something cold but clear. This was no longer a question, no longer a suspicion or a feeling I could ignore. This was fact, and facts, unlike feelings, do not change depending on how badly you want them to. I thought about the version of myself from just a few hours ago, sitting on the couch, believing everything was still intact, and it felt like I was remembering someone else's life. The motel sign buzzed again overhead, pulling me back into the moment, and I realized I had a choice, not about what was happening, because that part was already decided, but about what I was going to do with it. I reached for my phone again, not to call her, not to text, but to make a second recording, this time slower, more deliberate, capturing the car, the building, the room number one more time. If there was one thing I had learned in my life, it was that clarity matters, details matter, and tonight, I was going to make sure I had both. When I finally put the phone down again, I did not feel like shouting, did not feel like storming up those stairs. Instead, I felt something steadier, something controlled, like a line had been drawn and I had just stepped to the other side of it. I started the engine, the low rumble breaking the silence inside the car, and for the first time since I had pulled into that lot, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not to them, not to the situation, but to myself. Because whatever came next, it was not going to be built on guesses anymore. It was going to be built on what I now knew for certain. I did not drive home right away. Instead, I pulled out of the motel parking lot slowly, making a right turn like any other driver who had somewhere ordinary to be. But my hands stayed steady on the wheel and my mind stayed locked on what I had just seen. The road ahead stretched out under a line of dim streetlights, each one passing over the windshield in a rhythm that felt almost mechanical, like something was counting down inside me. I turned off the radio when I realized it was already playing, some late-night talk show voice filling the silence that I now needed. Quiet felt more honest. I replayed the last hour in my head, not emotionally, not like a man trying to make sense of betrayal, but like someone reviewing footage, checking details, confirming angles, making sure nothing could be misread later. The room number, the hallway, the timing. The way she moved, the way she smiled, all of it stored. Somewhere precise and sharp. I had spent years building a life on trust, but now I found myself building something else entirely. Something that did not rely on what she said, only on what I could prove. By the time I reached the main road, I already knew one thing for certain. I was not going to confront her tonight. That part was clear in a way that surprised me, because the version of me from before might have driven straight back. Waited in the driveway, demanded answers the second she walked through the door. But that version of me had been operating on assumptions, and assumptions were what got people blindsided. I needed more than that. I needed structure, timing, control. I stopped at a red light and glanced at my phone on the passenger seat, the screen still dark, no new messages, no missed calls, nothing to suggest she even realized how close the truth had come to catching up with her tonight. That silence told me something too. She was comfortable, she believed her story was intact, and that gave me something I had not expected to have, time. When the light turned green, I kept driving, not toward home yet, but toward a 24-hour coffee place I used to stop at after late shifts, a place where no one asked questions and no one cared how long you sat there. I pulled into the parking lot, parked near the edge, and stayed in the car for a minute before going inside. The air smelled like burnt coffee and sugar, familiar in a way that grounded me just enough. I ordered a black coffee, nothing else, and took a seat in the corner where I could see the door. I set my phone on the table and opened the video I had recorded. Watching it once, all the way through, forcing myself not to skip ahead, not to look away. It was exactly as I remembered, which somehow made it worse and better at the same time. Worse because there was no room left for doubt, better because doubt was no longer something I had to carry. When it ended, I did not replay it. I simply saved a copy to a cloud account I had not used in years, then another to a secure drive, methodical, deliberate. Like I was backing up something important for work. I stared at the screen for a moment after that, then locked it, and took a slow sip of coffee that tasted stronger than it should have. My reflection in the dark window looked calm, almost detached, and that realization settled in quietly. I was not reacting, I was planning. I thought about Claire, about how she would come home later tonight, maybe slip into bed beside me like nothing had happened, maybe mention her sister in passing, a small detail to reinforce the lie. I pictured myself responding the way I always had, nodding, keeping things smooth. But now it would be different, because I would know exactly what each word was worth. I leaned back in the chair and let that thought sit for a while. This was no longer about catching her, that part was done. This was about what came next and how I chose to handle it. People make mistakes when they act too fast, when they let emotion drive the moment, and I had no intention of giving up the one advantage I had just gained. Outside, a car pulled into the lot, headlights sweeping across the window for a second before fading, and I realized the world had not changed at all. Only my place in it had shifted. I finished the coffee, stood up, and walked out without rushing. When I got back into my car, I did not feel heavier, I felt clearer. I started the engine and this time I pointed it toward home, already knowing that whatever version of normal waited there was only temporary, and that the real conversation, the real shift, would happen on my terms, not hers. I pulled into the driveway a little after 10:30, the house sitting exactly the way I had left it. Porch light on, curtains drawn, nothing out of place, and for a second it felt like I had imagined everything, like I had stepped into someone else's night and then quietly returned to mine. I turned off the engine and stayed there for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, listening to the ticking sound of metal cooling under the hood, grounding myself in something simple and real. When I finally stepped out, the air felt cooler than before, or maybe I just noticed it more. I unlocked the front door and walked in, the familiar smell of home meeting me in a way that felt almost rehearsed, like it had no idea anything had changed. I set my keys down in the same spot, hung my jacket the same way I always did, every movement deliberate, controlled, because routine has a way of keeping things from slipping. The living room was quiet, television off, the faint glow of the kitchen light spilling across the floor. I checked the time again, 10:36, and did a quick calculation in my head. Distance, traffic, how long it would take her to leave, to drive, to arrive, to walk through that door and continue the version of the night she had already written. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip, not because I was thirsty but because it gave me something to hold, something to steady the moment. My phone buzzed softly against the countertop and I looked down, her name lighting up the screen. "Hey, still at my sister's, might crash here, do not wait up." The message read, simple, consistent, clean. I stared at it for a second longer than necessary, then typed back, "No problem, get some rest," and hit send without hesitation. The response came naturally, like muscle memory. But this time it carried a different weight, because I knew exactly what it was worth. I set the phone down and let out a quiet breath, not heavy, not sharp, just steady. This was what control felt like. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch, leaning back, eyes drifting across the space we had built together, pictures on the wall, small details that told a story I now understood differently. It was strange how nothing had physically changed, and yet everything had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I reached for my phone again and opened the video, not to watch it this time, but to confirm it was there, stored, safe, something solid in a situation that had been built on words. I checked the backup again, then locked the screen and placed it face down on the table. Outside, a car passed by, headlights briefly illuminating the room before fading away. And I realized how quiet the house really was without her in it. I thought about the nights before, the conversations that felt normal, the small laughs, the shared routines, and how easy it had been to believe in them. But belief is not the same as truth, and tonight had drawn a line between the two. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and let my thoughts settle into something more structured. Reacting would be easy, walking into that motel, calling her out, demanding explanations, but easy does not mean effective. I needed more than a moment. I needed a position, something that could not be twisted or denied. I stood up and walked toward the hallway, stopping briefly at the bedroom door before pushing it open. Everything inside was exactly as expected, bed made, her side untouched since she left, a quiet reminder of the gap between what was said and what was real. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed, looking around slowly, not searching for anything specific, just taking it in. Then I reached for the nightstand and opened the drawer, pulling out a small notepad and a pen. I wrote down the time I had seen the car, the location, the room number, every detail I could recall clearly, not because I would forget, but because writing it made it concrete, something that existed outside of my head. When I finished, I closed the notebook and placed it back where it had been, nothing out of place, nothing disturbed. I stood up, turned off the light, and walked back into the living room, the house settling around me in its usual quiet rhythm. Whatever happened next, it would not be rushed, it would not be emotional, it would be deliberate. And as I sat there, waiting for a version of her to come home that no longer existed, I realized that the man she thought she was deceiving was already gone, replaced by someone who was no longer guessing, no longer assuming, but simply watching, waiting, and preparing for the moment when everything would finally be said out loud. I stayed awake longer than I needed to, sitting in the same spot on the couch while the clock on the wall moved past midnight, then 1, then closer to 2, not because I expected her to walk through the door, but because I wanted to feel the full weight of the silence she had created. At some point, I stood up, turned off the lights, and went to bed, not out of exhaustion, but because routine still had its place. Even now, sleep did not come easily, but when it did, it was shallow, the kind that never really lets you go. I woke up just before 6, the sky outside still dim, the house exactly as it had been when I closed my eyes, and for a brief second, there was that old instinct to reach for my phone, to check for a message that might explain everything, but that instinct passed quickly. I got up, walked into the kitchen, and started the coffee maker like I always did, the familiar sound filling the space as if nothing had changed. I poured a cup, took a sip, and stood by the window, watching the early morning light settle over the street, calm, predictable, untouched by anything that had happened the night before. My phone buzzed again, and I did not rush to it this time. When I finally picked it up, her message was waiting. Just woke up, heading home soon. Simple, casual, like the night had gone exactly as she said it would. I read it once, then set the phone back down without replying. There was no urgency anymore. No need to fill the space with immediate reactions. Instead, I walked into the bedroom, got dressed for the day, and moved through each step with the same measured pace I had used the night before. Control was not something you announce, it is something you maintain quietly. By the time I heard the sound of her car pulling into the driveway, I was already sitting at the kitchen table, coffee in front of me, phone face down. The picture of a man starting an ordinary morning, the front door opened, her footsteps light, familiar, followed by the soft click of her setting down her keys. "Hey!" she called out, her voice carrying that same easy tone I had heard 1,000 times before. I looked up just as she walked into the kitchen, hair slightly out of place, jacket still on, eyes scanning my face for something, maybe confirmation, maybe nothing at all. "You are up early," she said, setting her bag down, moving toward the counter like this was just another morning. I nodded once, taking another sip of coffee, letting the moment breathe before responding. "Could not sleep much," I said, keeping my voice even, steady, exactly the way it had always been. She gave a small sympathetic smile, the kind that fit perfectly into the version of the story she was telling. "Yeah, my sister kept me up talking half the night," she added, pouring herself a glass of water without hesitation. I watched her for a second, not openly, just enough to catch the details, the rhythm of her movements, the way she avoided looking directly at me for more than a second at a time. It was subtle, but now that I knew, it was impossible to ignore. I leaned back slightly in my chair and set the cup down, the sound of ceramic against wood breaking the quiet just enough to shift the moment. "That is good," I said, simple, neutral, giving her nothing to react against. She nodded, took a sip of water, and glanced at her phone, her thumb moving quickly across the screen before she set it down again. The room settled into a strange version of normal, two people moving through familiar motions while standing on completely different ground. I stood up after a moment, and walked past her toward the sink, rinsing out my cup, giving her space to continue the story she had already committed to. "I have an early meeting," I said, drying my hands, keeping my tone consistent, predictable. "I will head out soon." She nodded again, stepping slightly out of my way, her expression relaxed, confident, untouched by doubt, and that was the moment it became clear just how far this had gone, not because of what she said, but because of how easily she said it. I grabbed my keys from the counter and paused for a second before heading toward the door, turning just enough to look at her without changing my expression. "Drive safe next time," I added, casual, almost offhand, the kind of comment that could mean nothing or everything depending on how it was heard. She blinked once, just a fraction too slow, then smiled, brushing it off with a quick nod. "I always do," she replied. I gave a small nod in return and walked out the door without another word, stepping into the morning light with a clarity that had not been there the day before. Because now, every word, every glance, every moment had a place, and I was no longer the one trying to catch up to the truth. I was the one setting the pace for what would come next. I did not go straight to the office after leaving the house. Instead, I drove a few blocks past my usual turn and pulled into a quiet parking lot across from a small park. The kind of place where early morning joggers pass through without paying attention to who is sitting in a car. I turned off the engine and sat there, watching the sunlight slowly break across the trees, thinking not about what had happened, but about what I needed to do next. The difference mattered more than I expected. Reacting was easy, planning required something else entirely. I reached for my phone and opened the Notes app, not the one I had used the night before, but a new file, clean, empty, something that would hold what came next without mixing it with anything emotional. I started listing details, not feelings, not assumptions, just facts, dates, times, behaviors. Small shifts that I had noticed over the past months but never fully acknowledged. Late meetings that ran longer than expected. Weekends that suddenly had plans I was not part of, phone calls taken in another room, messages that used to be shared now kept private. One by one, they lined up in a way that felt almost clinical, like I was stepping back and looking at a pattern instead of a moment. When I finished, I read through it once, not searching for meaning, just confirming accuracy, then saved it and locked the phone again. I sat there a little longer, letting the quiet settle, then started the engine and headed toward the office, this time following my normal route. Work had always been a place where things made sense, where effort translated into results, where problems had solutions that did not depend on someone else's honesty. I parked, walked in, greeted people the same way I always did, and sat down at my desk with a calm that felt almost out of place. Emails, meetings, numbers, everything moved forward as expected. And for a few hours I let myself stay in that structure, focusing on what was in front of me. But clarity does not disappear just because you ignore it, it waits, steady, until you are ready to act on it. Around mid-morning, I opened my browser and searched for something I had never thought I would need, a local attorney who specialized in family law. I did not rush, did not click the first result. Instead I read, compared, looked for someone with a reputation for precision. Someone who understood how to handle situations that required more than just surface-level decisions. After a few minutes, I found a name that stood out, not flashy, not over-marketed, just consistent, and I wrote it down. I did not call yet. There was no need to move that fast. Information first, then action. I closed the browser and leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen for a second before returning to my work. The rest of the day moved the same way, steady, controlled, every action measured against a plan that was starting to take shape without needing to be spoken out loud. When lunchtime came, I did not go out with coworkers like I usually did. Instead I stayed at my desk, opened my phone again, and checked the cloud storage where I had saved the video. Still there, exactly as it should be. I uploaded a second copy to another secure location, then closed it without watching. Repetition builds certainty. Later in the afternoon, a message from Claire appeared, something casual about dinner, asking if I wanted to pick something up on the way home. I read it once, then replied with the same tone I had used that morning. "Sure, whatever you feel like." "Nothing more, nothing less," she responded with a quick confirmation, and that was it, a normal exchange on the surface. But now every word carried a different weight. By the time the workday ended, I had not raised my voice, had not shown any sign that anything was different, and that was exactly the point. Control is not about what you say, it is about what you choose not to reveal. I shut down my computer, grabbed my keys, and walked out of the building with the same steady pace I had maintained all day. As I stepped into the evening air, I realized something had shifted again, not in the situation, but in me. I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I was building a path forward based on what I already knew, and as I got into my car and started the engine, one thought settled in quietly, clear and precise. Whatever came next would not be driven by anger or impulse, it would be driven by decisions that could not be undone. And I was going to make sure every one of them was made on my terms. I did not rush home that evening, even though everything in me knew that was where the next part of this would unfold. Instead, I made one more stop before heading back, pulling into a quiet office park where the building I had looked up earlier stood with its lights still on. The sign outside matched the name I had written down that morning, simple, professional, nothing exaggerated, and that was exactly what I wanted. I checked the time, just past 5:30, and sat there for a moment, considering whether to walk in or schedule something later, but then I realized hesitation did not serve me anymore. I stepped out of the car and walked inside. The lobby quiet except for the soft hum of overhead lights and the faint sound of a printer somewhere. Down the hall, a receptionist looked up, polite but curious, and I introduced myself in a calm, even tone, explaining that I was looking for information, not a full consultation yet, just clarity on what options looked like. She nodded, understanding more than I needed to say, and handed me a short form to fill out. Name, contact information, general situation. I kept it minimal, precise. Not because I was hiding anything, but because details would come later, in the right setting. A few Minutes passed before a man stepped out from an office down the hall, mid-40s maybe, composed, the kind of presence that suggested he had seen situations like mine more times than he could count. He introduced himself, firm handshake, direct eye contact, and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. I nodded once and followed him into his office, closing the door behind me. The room was simple, organized, nothing unnecessary, which made it easier to focus. He did not ask for a long story, just a summary, and I gave it to him the same way I had written it earlier, facts, timeline, no emotion attached. When I mentioned having documentation, he did not react with surprise, just nodded slightly, like that was expected. He asked a few questions, specific ones, about assets, accounts, how things were structured, and I answered each one carefully, realizing how much of my life had been built on assumptions I had never thought to question. When the conversation paused, he leaned back slightly and said something that stayed with me longer than anything else that day. The strongest position is the one built before the other side knows there is a position at all. I did not respond right away, but I understood exactly what he meant. We discussed next steps, not actions to take immediately, but things to prepare, documents to gather, accounts to review, details to verify. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, just a framework. When I stood up to leave, he handed me a card and told me to reach out when I was ready to move forward. No pressure, no urgency, just a clear path. I thanked him, shook his hand again, and walked out of the office feeling something different than I had that morning. Not relief, not satisfaction, but direction. By the time I got back into my car, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and for a moment I sat there, looking at the card in my hand before placing it carefully into my wallet. This was no longer just about what had happened, it was about what I was building next. I started the engine and finally headed home, the drive familiar, almost routine, but now layered with a quiet awareness that everything inside that house was about to shift, even if it did not show on the surface yet. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was already there, parked in the same spot as always, as if it had never been anywhere else. I turned off the engine and took a slow breath before stepping out, not to prepare for a confrontation, but to step back into a role I now understood completely. Inside, the smell of dinner met me at the door, something simple, something normal, and Claire's voice followed a second later, calling out from the kitchen like nothing had changed. I walked in, set my keys down, and met her gaze with the same calm expression I had carried all day. She smiled, asked how work was, moved through the motions of an ordinary evening, and I responded in kind, every word measured, every reaction controlled. The conversation flowed the way it always had, light, unremarkable, built on a foundation that no longer existed. But that was the point. I was not there to disrupt it yet, I was there to observe it, to let it continue just long enough for everything I needed to fall into place. As I sat down at the table across from her, watching her talk about her day, I realized something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. She still believed she was ahead of the truth, and that belief was the one thing I was not going to take away from her, at least not yet, because sometimes the strongest move is not the one you make first, but the one you make when the other person has already committed to the wrong version of the story. The evening settled into a rhythm that would have felt ordinary just days ago, the sound of utensils against plates, the low hum of the television in the background, Claire moving through the kitchen with the same practiced ease she always had, and me sitting across from her, listening more than speaking, not because I had nothing to say, but because every word now had a purpose. She talked about small things, a conversation with a coworker, a plan for the weekend, details that filled space without really meaning anything, and I nodded at the right moments, responding just enough to keep everything balanced. It was almost precise, the way we moved around each other, like two people following a script that only one of us knew was already broken. After dinner, she cleared the plates and I offered to help, the same way I always did, and she smiled, thanked me, nothing out of place, nothing that would suggest anything was wrong. But now I noticed the pauses, the slight delays in her responses, the way her eyes flicked toward her phone whenever it lit up, small things that would have been invisible before, now standing out with sharp clarity. I dried the last dish and set it aside, then leaned against the counter for a moment, watching her as she wiped down the surface, her movements efficient, controlled, like someone who had done this 1,000 times. "Long day tomorrow," I said casually, more of a statement than a question, and she nodded without looking up. "Yeah, probably," she replied, her tone even, predictable. I let a second pass, then added, "I might be out late myself." Giving her something to work with, something to respond to, she glanced up briefly, just enough to register the comment, then smiled again, that same familiar expression that now felt slightly out of sync. "Okay, just text me," she said, and went back to what she was doing. I nodded once and stepped away, walking into the living room, giving her space while also giving myself a clearer view of the situation. This was not about catching her in another lie. This was about understanding how far she was willing to go to maintain the one she had already told. I sat down on the couch and picked up my phone, not to check messages, but to open the calendar, scrolling through the next few days. Mapping out time in a way I had not needed to before. Timing mattered. Now, not just for me, but for how everything would unfold. A few minutes later, she joined me, sitting on the opposite end of the couch, close enough to feel familiar, distant enough to feel different. She leaned back, relaxed, scrolling through her own phone, occasionally glancing at the television without really watching it. I noticed the way her posture stayed slightly angled away. The subtle shift that suggested attention divided between two places. I did not comment, did not ask, just observed. After a while, she stood up, stretching lightly, and mentioned she was going to take a shower before bed. I nodded again, the same controlled response, and watched as she walked down the hallway, the sound of the bathroom door closing followed by the steady rush of water. I waited a few seconds, then stood up quietly and moved to the spot where she had been sitting. Her phone was still on the cushion, screen dark, but present. I looked at it for a moment, not reaching for it, not crossing that line yet, just acknowledging that it existed as part of the larger picture. Then I stepped back, returning to my seat, because this was not about acting on impulse, it was about choosing the right moment. The water continued running, steady, consistent, and I leaned back, letting the sound fill the room while my mind moved ahead, organizing, preparing. This situation was no longer unpredictable. It was structured, every piece falling into place with a clarity that made the next step almost inevitable. When she came back, hair damp, expression relaxed, she sat down again like nothing had shifted, and I met her presence with the same calm I had carried all day. We talked briefly about nothing in particular, then moved toward bed, the routine continuing as if it still held meaning. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing settle into sleep, I understood something with absolute certainty. She believed the story was still intact, that every detail had been managed, that nothing had slipped, and that belief, more than anything else, was what made what came next possible. Because when someone is certain they are not being watched, that is when they reveal the most, and I was done guessing, done assuming. Now I was simply waiting for the exact moment when everything would align, and when it did, there would be no room left for denial, not for her, and not for me. I woke up before the alarm, not because I had slept well, but because something in me had already decided that today was not going to follow the same pattern as the days before. The room was still dim. Early light just starting to edge through the curtains, and Claire was still asleep beside me, breathing steady, peaceful in a way that would have felt comforting once, but now only felt distant. I lay there for a moment, not moving, letting the quiet settle into something final, something that marked a line between what had been and what was about to happen. Then I got up, moved through the routine the same way I always did: shower, coffee, getting dressed, every action measured, controlled, nothing rushed. She woke up shortly after, asking something about breakfast, about plans for the day, her voice soft, casual, completely unaware that the ground beneath everything had already shifted. I answered simply, no tension, no edge, just enough to keep the rhythm intact. When we sat at the table, I noticed how normal everything looked: sunlight across the counter, the same cups, the same quiet morning sounds, and it struck me how easy it would have been to stay in that version of things. To ignore what I knew and continue forward like nothing had changed. but clarity does not let you go back once you have it. I finished my coffee, set the cup down, and looked at her, not for long, just enough to register the moment. "We should talk tonight," I said, calm, steady, the kind of statement that does not invite immediate reaction but leaves no room for misunderstanding. She paused for a fraction of a second, then nodded, brushing it off with a light "Okay, about what?" But I did not answer. "Just later," I said, standing up and grabbing my keys. I left the house the same way I had the day before, but this time there was no uncertainty about where things were heading. The workday passed like the others, structured, focused, each task completed without distraction, but underneath it all, there was a quiet sense of alignment, like everything was moving toward a point that had already been decided. I made one call during lunch, brief, direct, confirming the next step with the attorney, setting a time, nothing dramatic, just a continuation of the plan. By the time I drove home that evening, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the street. And the house looked exactly the same as it always had, calm, unchanged, waiting. Inside, Claire was in the kitchen again, preparing dinner, turning to greet me with the same familiar smile, asking about my day, moving through the motions that had defined our life together. I responded as I always did, set my keys down, took off my jacket, sat at the table. Dinner passed in a quiet, almost careful conversation, both of us aware of something unspoken, even if only one of us understood what it really was. When the plates were cleared and the room settled into silence, I leaned back slightly in my chair and looked at her directly, holding her gaze just long enough to shift the moment. "You said you were at your sister's the other night," I began, my voice even, not accusatory, just factual. She nodded immediately, too quickly, her expression steady but just a little too practiced. "Yeah, why?" she replied, and that was when I reached for my phone, not with hesitation, not with emotion, but with the same control I had maintained since the moment I saw her car. I unlocked it, opened the video, and turned the screen toward her, letting it play without explanation. The room stayed silent as the footage moved, the motel, the car, the hallway, the door, every detail clear, undeniable. I did not watch her reaction at first. I watched the screen, making sure it played all the way through, that nothing was missed, nothing left open to interpretation. When it ended, I locked the phone and set it down on the table between us, then finally looked at her. Whatever expression she had before was gone, replaced by something else, something that had not been part of the story she had prepared. I did not raise my voice, did not lean forward, did not press for an answer. Instead, I said one sentence. Simple, controlled, final. "We are done pretending." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, not because of what I said, but because of what it meant. There was no argument to win, no explanation that could change what had already been seen. Everything that had been built on assumption was now replaced by fact, and facts do not negotiate. I stood up slowly, picking up my keys again, not in anger, not in urgency, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already made the decision long before the words were spoken. As I walked toward the door, I paused just once, not to look back, but to acknowledge the moment for what it was, the end of one version of my life and the beginning of another, one that would not be built on guesswork or trust without proof, but on clarity, on control, and on the understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not react in the moment, but wait until the truth reveals itself, and then act when it can no longer be denied.